And now I would like to cover all of the fighting in World War II by American soldiers in, 20 minutes or less. Sound good? Let's do it. If you want an in-depth analysis, battle by battle, you can literally find thousands of videos that will do that. As always, we just want to understand the big picture of the war as it relates to US history. So the US declares war at the end of 1941 and quickly mobilizes from a standing military of about 190,000 soldiers to millions of people ready to fight, not just in Europe, but also in the Pacific. How do we do that? Well, in Europe, by 1942, the Allies had been effectively kicked out of mainland Europe, and it was only Soviet Russia keeping Germany from controlling the entire continent. So American troops are working with the Western Allies to make our way closer to enemy lines. We need a foothold from which to launch an invasion to liberate Western Europe. This meant that in the early years of the war, we were doing a lot of fighting in North Africa and then up through Italy for the first year or two of US involvement. And it should be noted that our dear friend Stalin felt like we were moving a little too slowly, considering that millions of his men were dying while we inched our way along. I'm sure that won't be a problem later on. Now, in the Pacific, the strategy was different and relatively simple. We just had to get close enough to the island of Japan to be able to bomb it. From our base of operations in Australia, we basically had to hopscotch around the Pacific, taking tiny islands, building airstrips and refueling bases, and then moving on to the next set of islands. It's like when you played The Floor is Lava as a kid, and you had two couch cushions to use. You would put one down in front of you to step on, pick up the other one from behind you, and move it forward. It was slow but effective. Now, this island hopping campaign is going to be brutal for the troops on the ground, and it's also going to rely heavily on the Navy, both on the sea and in the air, for support. One note, you might be remembering that at the beginning of this story, we controlled the Philippines. Like, why couldn't we just use that as our base, which was way closer to Japan? Well, the Japanese thought of that. That's why the Philippine Islands were invaded just 10 hours after the Pearl Harbor attack began. General MacArthur, who was basically the head of the army in the Pacific, retreated with his men to Bataan Peninsula, where they held out for 3 months as they slowly ran out of food, supplies, and medicine to combat disease. Controversially, MacArthur evacuated himself from Bataan to head to safety in Australia, and now he was ordered to do so by FDR, but MacArthur has a history and a future of ignoring orders, so just saying, he could have stayed if he really wanted to. But when he left, he famously told his troops, "I came through and I shall return." After the defenses at Bataan fell, the remaining troops were forced to surrender, and 78,000 American prisoners of war were marched 65 miles to Japanese prison camps. 10,000 troops died on the trip, which became known as the Bataan Death March. And this event is important for understanding MacArthur's motivations later on in the war, because basically there's going to be an ongoing debate over strategy in the Pacific. MacArthur wants to use his army to secure larger land masses, liberating places like the Philippines on the way to Japan. Head of the Navy, Chester Nimitz, great name, wants to use his Navy and Marines to just bypass those larger islands. He sees them as a trap, and instead focus on smaller islands to get to Japan as quickly as possible. Now, in the end, they kind of do both. And spoiler alert, the effort to retake the Philippines is going to be enormously costly in terms of both money and lives, specifically Filipino lives. In general, Nimitz's island hopping campaign was the most effective and the one that allowed his navy to shine, but it wasn't easy. Essentially, every island had to be taken by storming the beaches into a jungle filled with Japanese soldiers. We'll talk more about D-Day soon, but if you know anything about that, then just imagine that basically every island hop required a mini D-Day invasion of its own. And one of the aspects of fighting in the Pacific that's especially fascinating is the role that codebreaking played. If you've seen The Imitation Game, then you know that this was important in Europe too, but codebreaking will be famously instrumental in the turning point battle in the Pacific, Midway. Essentially, besides the initial attack at Pearl Harbor, Midway is going to be the closest the Japanese Navy ever got to North America during the actual war. In the summer of 1942, the American naval fleet that had escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor was camped out near the island of Midway, and the Japanese wanted to destroy it. For context, we had just fought the Battle of Coral Sea, the first naval battle in world history where the fighting ships never even saw each other. The battle was fought entirely by planes launching from opposing ships, and there was no clear winner in the battle itself, but the after effects were a win for the US. For one, we destroyed or damaged 2 of their battleships, so they were not able to participate in the next even larger battle, but it also marked the first time that we stopped the Japanese advance across the Pacific. And although one of our ships, the Yorktown, was seriously damaged, it was repaired and back in action in just 3 days. And this brings us to a really important point. How did the US win the war? We'll talk more about it in a few minutes, but one of the main answers is that our factories won the war. Meaning the industrial capacity that the US had built up since the Gilded Age and that kicked into high gear by the government during the war, motivated by the decade of the Depression. This was a huge advantage over other countries. Throughout the war, for every 1 warship built by the Japanese, the US built 16. And the fact that 2 of the Japanese aircraft carriers were out of commission for months while ours was back in the water in 3 days is evidence of just how efficient and effective our industry at the home front had grown to be. Thanks, Rosie. Anyway, after the Battle of Coral Sea, the Japanese had made a plan to attack an island near Pearl Harbor and draw the American fleet into a trap. But cryptographers had been working for months to break Japanese code, analyzing radio messages from weather reports to battle plans, and they believed they'd done it. The codebreakers figured out that the code AF, insert jokes here, referred to our base at the Midway Atoll, but not everyone was so sure. There was a real fear that this was the trap, and the Japanese were actually going to attack Hawaii or the West Coast. So the codebreakers set their own trap. They instructed radio operators at Midway to send a message to Pearl Harbor that their saltwater evaporators had broken down. Soon after, the American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese message saying that AF was running out of drinking water. Aha! Gotcha! We figured it out. With this information, Pacific Fleet Commander Chester Nimitz put his ships in a position to surprise the Japanese ships that were setting up the trap. It was a trap within a trap. Admiral Akbar is freaking out. Military historians have called the ensuing Battle of Midway, quote, the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. Japan lost all 4 of its fleet carriers. 3 of them were destroyed in less than an hour, and in comparison, the US only lost 1. And the Japanese lost 3,000 men, 10 times more than the US's 300 deaths. And this was the turning point, after which the US forces were slowly pushing the Japanese back toward Japan. As one historian put it, that the Americans at Midway changed the course of World War II is indisputable. At 10 o'clock on the morning of June 4th, 1942, the Japanese were winning the Pacific War. An hour later, 3 Japanese aircraft carriers were on fire and sinking. The Battle of Midway happened in June of 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor. However, the war in the Pacific wouldn't end for another 3 years. Again, taking each island took an enormous amount of time, manpower, and sacrifice. For example, just a few months later, the first US land offensive in the Pacific started to take over Guadalcanal. And the battle, it was really a series of battles, took 6 months, and is another example of the US turn from defense to offense. And as the Navy hops from island chain to island chain, MacArthur's army gets bogged down trying to recapture the Philippines. Now, let's pause here and rewind a bit to see what's going on at the same time in Europe. So, it's 1942. Looking at the global conflict, the tide has turned in the Pacific with Midway, and on the Eastern European front with Stalingrad. For more detail, go check out my Season 1 podcast episode on the war, or just ask your uncle. Now, the Allies have to figure out how to take control of Western Europe. By 1943, they come up from the south through North Africa and eventually Italy. And remember how the whole Western strategy was just trying to find a foothold in Western Europe so that we could invade and liberate the people from Nazi control? Well, we finally do just that in 1944. The major turning point in the European theater is the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France, known as D-Day. Officially, this is known as the Battle of Normandy, and its codename was Operation Overlord. On June 6, 1944, 156,000 American, Canadian, and British forces landed on 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of heavily fortified French coastline. Over 5,000 ships brought 160,000 troops. 60,000 of those men died before they even made it to the shore. And the fiercest fighting for the Americans was at Omaha Beach. Of the first company of men who left the boats and stormed the beaches, 2/3 died without firing a single shot. 13,000 paratroopers had already parachuted into France and were behind enemy lines to gain control of important infrastructure, like roads and bridges, that would allow the invading forces to march through France. Now, there's an HBO miniseries called Band of Brothers that follows a group of paratroopers who were involved in D-Day. It's incredible. Like, stop watching this, Pause, go watch that, and then come back. Welcome back. Wasn't it so good? Okay, the D-Day invasion took an enormous amount of coordination and planning, all of which was overseen by American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, our future president. Over 425,000 people were killed or went missing during the Battle of Normandy. 2,500 Americans died in a single day, but the Allied victory turned the tide in the war in Western Europe. From D-Day on, the Allies are advancing toward the hearts of the Axis powers. The Americans, French, and British are closing in on Germany from the west. The Russians are coming from the east, and over in the Pacific, the Americans are working their way across the ocean to get within striking distance of Japan. Oh yeah, because over in the Pacific, the US was finally fighting on Japanese home territory at Iwo Jima and then Okinawa. At Iwo Jima, it was clear from the beginning that the US had the upper hand, but the Japanese forced us to pay a high cost. It's the only engagement of the whole Pacific theater where the US had more casualties, that means dead or injured, than the Japanese, although around 18,000 Japanese died compared with almost 7,000 for the US. And you probably know it as the place where they took the famous raising the flag photo. After conquering Iwo Jima, the US had complete control of the skies. We could launch bombers and stealth aircraft over the entire territory of Japan. And after the 3-month-long battle at Okinawa, in which 12,000 Americans and potentially 100,000 Okinawan people and Japanese soldiers died, the US was finally capable of staging a land invasion of Japan. So by 1945, the Allied powers were closing in on all sides. The Battle of the Bulge that occurred the previous winter along the borders of Belgium and Luxembourg was the last huge defense by the Nazis before they were retreating back into Germany. At that point over in Europe, it was a race to the capital Berlin between the English, French, and Americans from the west and the Soviets from the east. Now, the Soviets got there first, but not before Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April 30th, 1945. The war in Europe was over, so how did we win it? Our industrial capacity was a huge help, and D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge were significant American achievements. But, in reality, Europe was saved from Hitler by the Russians. For most of the war, all of the other allies had been pushed off the continent completely, and really the only thing keeping Germany from expanding even further and potentially having the power to conquer England directly was the fact that they had to hold off millions of Russians over on the Eastern Front. Approximately 14 million Russians died during the war. That's 13% of their total population. By comparison, 400,000 Americans died, approximately 0.23% of our population. Now, I'm in no way suggesting that 400,000 dead Americans is not horrific, but it's important to understand the magnitude of loss that Russia experienced. And when you add in the deaths of all the members of the Soviet Union, that total comes to 26.6 million people dead. We'll talk more about this when we get into the Cold War, but just keep that in mind. There's a lot of resentment within the Soviet Union by people who feel like they made the largest sacrifices during the war, while from their perception, the US and its allies sat back for a few years just kind of casually planning D-Day. Now, to be clear, that's not what actually happened, but were we probably fine that most of the people dying on our side were communists who were only allies out of convenience? Yeah, sure. Now, over in the Pacific Theater, the war is still going on, and it's quite clear how we win that one. We bombed Japan into oblivion. And I'm not just talking about the 2 atomic bombs, because that's what everyone jumps to. But by the time we dropped those 2 atomic bombs, the US had been conducting air raids and firebombing campaigns on Japan to some extent for almost 3 years. Going back to the point about the importance of US innovation, engineering, and production during this time, a turning point came with the creation of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress in late 1942. It cost $3 billion to design and produce. For reference, the Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bombs, cost $1.9 billion. Basically, the B-29 could fly and drop bombs at both high and low altitudes, and it could fly much further, making it easier to hit Japan from safer distances. Now, that's the most detail I'm ever going to give you about military aircraft, but one thing I just want to make sure we understand is that it wasn't that we were island hopping, and then all of a sudden we just dropped 2 atomic bombs. We had been conducting traditional air raids on Japan for years, and in the last year of the war, we began firebombing campaigns of major cities, especially Tokyo. And I'll be honest, this is something I didn't quite understand until more recently, but firebombing is just a more general term for using napalm. Like, napalm was invented by Harvard scientists during the war specifically as part of a competition among various scientific institutions to create the most destructive substance that would burn down Tokyo's wooden buildings the most effectively. And the trick with napalm is that when it explodes, it splatters a fiery gel that sticks to whatever it lands on and then continues burning. It's horrible. In March of 1945, as Allies are closing in on Berlin and the European theater, US warplanes dropped 2,000 incendiary bombs on Tokyo in just 48 hours. 16 square miles of the densely populated city burned to the ground, and between 80,000 and 130,000 Japanese people were killed in just a few hours. And I bring this up for a few reasons. One, it's something that a lot of Americans don't learn about, and that's my wheelhouse. That's what you need to know. But second, this firebombing campaign was just as destructive and deadly, at least immediately, than the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And finally, it's important as context for the ultimate decision to drop the atomic bombs. Now, I'm going to leave it to each of you to decide how you feel about the decision to drop the only 2 nuclear weapons ever used in war. But as you develop your own opinion, the question at the time was, how can we end the war without having to invade Japan? Fighting throughout the Pacific had shown us that the Japanese were willing to fight to the last man, literally. Often, when it was clear that the battle was basically over, instead of surrendering, the Japanese would run at the US troops in a suicide attack. On other islands, they convinced civilians to jump off cliffs en masse rather than being taken by the US. It was kind of clear at this point that we would ultimately win the war with Japan, but how long was it going to take? It was estimated at the time by the War Department that a land invasion of Japan would lead to 1.7 to 4 million more Allied casualties, deaths, and serious injuries. And assuming the Japanese civilians took up the fight as well, they estimated 5 to 10 million Japanese fatalities. But there was also another reason that the US wanted the war with Japan to end quickly. The Soviets were coming. Now that Germany had surrendered by the middle of 1945, the Soviet army could send some of its troops east to help the US fight in Korea, China, Japan, and Southeast Asia. And that seemed nice and all, but we weren't thrilled with the idea of Stalin getting a say in how the Pacific theater would be divided up after the war. I mean, especially considering we did most of the fighting and dying over there. Essentially, the Cold War was quietly beginning as World War II was ending, and President Truman understood the importance of having territory in Asia whenever that shaky alliance between the US and the Soviets inevitably collapsed. The faster we could force Japan to surrender, the less territory the Soviets could lay claim to in East Asia. So those are the 2 rational arguments for ending the war quickly. And at the time, the US military truly felt that it had tried everything else. I mean, if firebombing Tokyo didn't do it, we weren't sure what else would. After telling Britain, but not our other main ally, the Soviets, and giving a vague warning of prompt and utter destruction to the Japanese government, the US dropped the bomb nicknamed Little Boy on Hiroshima, a military-industrial center and port city. Still with no surrender from the Japanese, the bomb Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later, the same day the Soviets formally declared war on Japan. And now both cities were crucial to the Japanese war effort. Nagasaki was a major military port and the site of most of their shipbuilding and repair operations. But similar to what would have happened if the Japanese had bombed Detroit or New York City, those cities were filled with mostly civilians. And this takes us back to the idea introduced in the last episode about total war. World War II was the epitome of a total war because everyone was an asset, the soldiers, the kids buying war bonds at home, the Rosies riveting, but that meant that everyone was also a target. In the end, between 129,000 and 226,000 people were killed when the 2 atomic bombs were dropped. And this is not even considering the long-term complications and deaths associated with the lingering radiation. The Japanese surrendered and the post-war era began. So, the war is over. You know the drill. Everyone's dancing to Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy while sailors kiss random nurses in the street. Everyone is so happy to just go back to normal. Well, not everyone wants to go back to the way things were before 1941. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.